We have another distinguished group of speakers next. As they join us up front here, I will say that they have a lot to say, and I'm all ears, about the hottest issues affecting businesses and organizations of all types. Cybersecurity, privacy, and the changing nature of the Internet. What should we be thinking and doing to plan for these challenges, and of course to get ready for these challenges? So get ready now to have some light shed upon these questions. First, I'm pleased to introduce Edward M. Stroz. His name is on the door at Stroz Friedberg, which he founded, and where he is currently executive chairman. Before starting Stroz Friedberg, which specializes in investigations and risk management, he had a distinguished FBI career and was responsible for the formation of their computer crime squad in New York City. His bio is full of remarkable activities, and he'll give us the big picture view of cybersecurity and other material dangers, how we can identify perils and defend our businesses. Speaking next is Andrew Tannenbaum. Andrew is the lead cybersecurity counsel for IBM. Before joining IBM, Andrew held many senior national security posts, including General Counsel for Cybersecurity, General Counsel for Cyber at the National Security Agency. He's going to talk about the evolving legal landscape for cybersecurity. And it's an honor to introduce Ambassador Karen Kornbluh. She is now Executive Vice President for External Affairs at Nielsen, where she is the Global Head of Government and Public Affairs, Corporate Social Responsibility, Privacy Strategy, and Multicultural Market Development. Previously, Karen was the U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where she led development of the first global Internet policy making principles. She has worked on policy matters with former Secretary of State Clinton and also with President Obama when he was a senator. Karen will be discussing global trends in policy development affecting the Internet, privacy, and data management. And as we've been doing, each one will present individually, and then we'll have a group discussion. And again, please note your questions and we'll come around. So let's welcome Edward Stroz, Andrew Tannenbaum, and Karen Kornbluh.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I want to thank the Better Business Bureau for putting this on, because I was able to get here earlier to hear most of the speakers before. And I really think this is a very important area, and it's nice to see a convergence of people who bring a different perspective on the question, but you see the interrelationship to it and what is so important, sustainability and the kinds of things that are challenging our institutions. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about some things that I think help to set the stage that are relevant for all of us on the panel, and use that then for the springboard for some questions and answers later on. I mean, this is a topic that obviously is quite expansive, and to try to boil it down to something that I think is meaningful and comprehensible without being simplistic is what we're going to try to do. Let me see if we can get these slides to advance. There we are. So I find that people are aided when they get a sense of the quantity of the problem for cybercrime. Now, there are many types of cybercrime. It isn't always stealing personally identifiable information. There are other kinds. But let's not try to get our arms around too much of it. Let's just talk a little bit about the kind of data breach that you're reading about today. And I'm going to just give you some statistics. These are the freshest I could find. This is this year from the Ponemon Institute. They've been doing surveys and reporting on this for some years now. And as you can see, the average cost of a data breach for a company, they report, is $3.5 million. That's a lot of money. If you want to look at the annual increase over data breach over the prior years and what they've been seeing, it's about 15%. That's faster than the growth of the economy. And then the last statistic there is an attempt to try to quantify, if you just looked at the number of records that are stolen in a data breach and said, all right, and the cost is maybe an average of $3.5 million. What does that work out to be per record. And according to their statistics, it's about $145 per record. And the variations on this, I think, are rather significant, but at least you have something to keep in mind. So just imagine if you're an institution and you're keeping records on your customers, employees, and things of that nature, and if you're large, if that information is stolen, what kind of a financial impact is it going to have? Just on the dollar cost. We're not even getting into reputational risk. So you can see, I think it's rather significant. Now, in the next slide, again, same source. What are the kinds of things from a business level that actually they have found make the costs go up? And what are the things that actually help to reduce the cost on businesses? So you can see there on the left side, the green arrow, the factors that decrease the cost of data breaches. There are three main things. Having strong security. That may sound very generic to you, but it's a key concept. And I would say it's interesting to look to see in a company who controls the security budget, tell you a lot about how people have bought into this. Secondly, did you have an incident response plan? And I can tell you from the dozens of cases we have worked on, both in my company and even when I was in the FBI, many companies do not have a plan. And it's unfortunate. A good plan is better. A good plan that you have is better than the perfect plan that you never get around to putting in place or that can't sustain a 3-month period of time. Something is better than nothing. Planning in this area is key. And then the last factor, according to Poneman, is that you have a Chief Information Security Officer, a CISO or a CISO, often associated with the lower cost experiences. And then on the right-hand side, the factors that increase the cost of a data breach. If there was a lost or a stolen device involved, was there a third party that had to be brought in? And often you need that, but it does drive up the cost. Was quick notification involved? And I'll tell you, that's a strange one because we have had clients who have said things in order to sort of like make an early announcement that were wrong. And not just wrong in a way that was bad for them, the way you would expect. Sometimes they say things that didn't actually happen and they reported a worse condition than was truly the case. It's a tricky area to understand really what happened because when information is stolen, and this is probably one of the simple concepts that is the most bedeviling when information is stolen, is that everything that is stolen is still present in the network. There is no deprivation when the information is stolen. It's not like money. You can't copy money, you can copy data. So when these things occur, just determining what was stolen of all the things that you still have, it takes some work to be able to determine that because the answers are not always obvious. And then you also see another factor that increased the cost was the engagement of consultants like me. The next slide. This is, I think people are interested kind of, all right, we've talked about the cost, the factors. What are the causes? And according to Poneman, I'm keeping it with them so you'll have sort of a consistency here, and this is very fresh data. The single biggest root cause, the blue section of the circle there, 42% malicious or criminal attack. That's pretty big. Followed by almost equally human error and then a system glitch. And on human error or a system glitch, anybody can get tricked. Anybody. If I were to say here right now, I won't do it, say, who's the gorilla in the back of the room? You'd probably turn around to see what it is. And that's what happens with a phishing attack. You get an email, it looks like it's something legitimate, you click on it, you can be tricked. Anybody can be tricked. And so the idea of sort of like a maliciousness associated with it, it's not surprising that can be seen as a common root cause. And then the lower part of the slide there, the per capita cost for each root cause, and it gives you some of the breakdowns of it. In the interest of time, I won't spend much time on that. So let's move on now away from the Poneman Institute and just talk a little bit about how people and how companies are deciding what to invest in. I hear clients say, well, we spent X number of dollars on our IT systems, so we should spend X number of dollars protecting them. And I understand that thinking, but I don't think it's really right. It would be a little bit like comparing, the risk of fire by the cost of a book of matches or a gallon of gasoline. I don't think it really relates. I'm not saying spend crazily, but I think you really have to be careful about the metric comparisons that you're using. So if we just look at some of the data that we have, corporations are projected to spend about $67 billion on information security. That's a big number. My point would be make sure you're spending it in the right areas. Second box there, businesses spend an average about 5% of their IT budget on security in 2010. Those are the best numbers I have for these categories. And you can see how it breaks out. But if you go to the third box in red, hackers are stealing approximately $250 billion a year in intellectual property. That's a little bit of a hard number to quantify, but actually it's enormous. And it's very great here in the United States, and I can tell you we have worked on matters for clients where the intellectual property that was taken was at the core of the value of the business. And the amount of effort that they put into developing it and using it as an advantage in the marketplace was completely undermined when their competitor was able to get it. And I just would say then, as we lead into the next part, is information security, and in particular information security consulting in your area, effective? How do you measure effectiveness in this area? For business people, you've got a business to run. You've got to know something about security, but you can't really be too preoccupied with it unless you're a very large organization and still run your business effectively. So let me now try to move into the categories of what are the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the risk factors in a way that I think shows best practices for being able to manage this. On this slide, if you look at the left-hand side, there's a column there. These are the threats. Now, we've categorized them, and you're going to see slightly different categories from different companies, but they basically overlap. Competitors, state-sponsored adversaries, hacktivists, cyber criminals and terrorists, untrustworthy employees, and then lastly, careless or complacent behaviors. You'll hear a lot of times people talk about the insider threat or the insider risk. Many times that term is used and you think of somebody who has bad intentions. And yes, there are such people. But the insider threat or the insider risk also covers people who do things because they're tired, they're going through stressors in their life, they're being sloppy, whatever it might be. So when you look at the insider side, we don't want to demonize that risk unfairly, because yes, there's a part that can be demonized and there's a part that should not be. Now I find is a lot of times when people speak to these things, they identify the categories I just talked about, but they don't really make clear what do you do with those categories. How do those categories actually help you to manage the risk in this area? And I'd say the key thing is you have to look at the incentives that each of those categories have to penetrate your network. I'll give you a simple example as to why that isn't always an obvious answer. If you're in a financial services industry, it's probably pretty clear you think, hey, I might get hit. If you're in retail or you have a lot of customer credit card information and things, you could say, hey, I could get hit. If you're in another industry, you might say, well, who would really want me? All I do is handle air conditioning and heating. Or I'm an architectural firm. Or I'm a law firm. I can tell you that these adversaries in these different threat categories will sometimes attack your company because they think you won't notice it, and secondly, because it is a convenient hopping off point to attack the true target. One of the worst compromises we worked on, and we get called into many of the things you read about in the newspaper, one of the worst I've seen was for an architectural firm. And you would think, and it's a small one, you would think, well, how could they possibly be, a target for attack by one of these groups? In fact, they weren't the primary target. They wanted to get into the network in order to get to the primary target. So the primary target who they're after sees traffic with an architectural firm and doesn't assess it. In fact, it's an architectural firm they might even use, and they don't assess that as being any kind of a threat agent. It wouldn't be, except the traffic is coming from that network. It's not originating in that network. It's passing through that network. And not only do they use it to attack you, they will use that intermediate network to store what is stolen for a couple of days to see if the primary victim even notices what happened. If the alarm bells go off, they may drop it. If not, they'll probably say it's safe to bring the information we stole back to where we really want it. So my point is, when you look at these threat agents in these categories, you have to look at their incentives. They're very smart people, and they think through how can they attack you in a way that you're less likely to notice. And that's why knowing the threat agent categories are important. Then I just want to move over to the risk factors. So what you see is if you take those threats and then you say, all right, what are the risks that my organization faces, and how do I categorize those into managerially relevant areas of attention? We break them down into 4 areas. Governance, and that's been very key, I think, talking about today. And that includes disgruntled and untrustworthy employees, network administrative access, and ambiguous policies. Whatever your views are on Ed Snowden, just look at that situation. It's probably not the way you want to find out that you've got a problem inside your company or organization. And it really, if the governance isn't right, the tone at the top isn't right, I find that it usually doesn't matter. Somebody was reminding me earlier, our firm did a study to ask senior executives inside an organization whether they themselves, the C-level people, practice bad security by putting data in places it shouldn't be, by not activating passwords, and the majority of them do. It's like 62%. They're busy, they feel just like the rest of us, and we're trying to get things done. If you start doing that, what does that say to the rest of the people in the organization? You know, it basically makes, it hollows out the authority and the sincerity of what you do. Secondly, there you see technology vulnerabilities. This is very key. And I'll just give a quick example, even in technology though. We will run into clients and find out, for example, that a server has not been updated with the correct patches. And the junior consultants will say, that's our finding. And we have to say, no, that's what we found. But the thing that's going to help the client help the client more is why wasn't it patched? And I can tell you, we see examples where they didn't even know the server was on the network. That's one kind of condition. Secondly, they didn't have a policy to patch it. Thirdly, that they require patching be done when the person gets around to it rather than enforced. I mean, these are very different findings for us because it points to what the root cause was as to why the server didn't get patched. And if you don't know those things, I don't think you're giving your clients very good help. And then I just want to mention physical security vulnerabilities. This is a big area. If we want to attack your network, we can do it remotely. But if we can also get close to your technology, your cables, your wires, your cameras, your servers, we can do something too. And a lot of times that link between physical access and information access is not respected, and it's very key. It often is the source of a compromise. And then the last one there is business operations vulnerabilities, your third-party relationships and things of that nature. So if you look at the threat agents, look at the areas that you need to manage within an organization and relate the two and be strategic before you're tactical, I think you can manage these kinds of risks. And then just finally, before I close and turn over to my colleagues, this last slide is a sanitized example of the kind of information that we are finding audit committees and board level participants really find helpful. What it shows in one picture there is a simple example of the kind of vulnerabilities and findings that we found in their organization. And it's kind of difficult to read, but I'll just take you through it. If you go to the far right-hand side, that narrative section there's you'll see G1, G2, it's a little hard to make out. Those are areas of governance, and they find things like secure information management. Do we have a security architecture reference? Things in operations, laptop protection, remote access. We try to put these findings into governance, operations, policies, and technology. And then we try to categorize with our work as to how severe, or not even how severe, just where are you on a good, medium, or bad spectrum. Bad is red, green is good. And we plot them within this zone so that you can get a sense of where are you most vulnerable so that you can work on those things first. I do not find it helpful to give a client a list of, 6,000 things that, need to be worked on and no sense of what things should be worked on first. Priorities are key. And in fact, it's one of the areas that I think your consultant should be helping you with. You know you can't be perfect in security. How do you manage the risk in an intelligent way? I think you have to have priorities around what can hurt you the most. And that's going to depend a little bit on your network, but also what industry you're in, and how we assess the threat agents and their willingness to attack you, and how well you're set up to even notice the compromise. And then what we typically do in these examples is take this kind of information and then give them a second picture after the client has done some work to repair, and we show how things have hopefully come out of the red zone and gotten better. And I think that way you get the board, because a lot of board members have more gray hair than I do, and they don't feel comfortable discussing information security because they feel intimidated by it. The language that is used is something that they don't understand, and they're even afraid to ask a question or even know what question to ask. It's up to us to bring these issues to their way of thinking. And so these are smart people, they care, but if you can't convey in clear intonations what it is that we're talking about dealing with at the governance level, the rest doesn't take place. And so with that, I will turn it over to Andrew. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. Very nice to be here with you all and on this panel. As Ed explained really well, there are so many different types of cyber threats out there with the potential for big costs to your business. And when you talk about, when you're at groups and events like this and you talk about the cyber threat, sometimes you feel like the messenger of doom and gloom. Maybe my colleagues here feel a little bit like that. It's a little bit like, that scene in Willy Wonka where Gene Wilder, I have little kids, so I've just seen this a few times recently. Willy Wonka takes everyone on that boat ride through that really creepy tunnel, and it's really dark, and they're going really fast, and they're flashing these scary images at him as they go by, and he's singing that kind of creepy song, and they're all like, "Get me off this boat! I want out of here." I feel like the cyber threat. We talk about hacktivists and criminals taking all your information and spies, and then you get into the serious stuff, critical infrastructure going down and cyber warfare. Sometimes you want to just get off the boat, and it feels a little bit overwhelming. But I think the message, and this really ties into what Ed was just saying about a risk-based strategy and mitigating the risk. You can't ever deal with completely eliminate the threat. It's too easy these days for the cyber adversaries to hack in and get into systems, and there's too many open doors. But there are important things and practical things you can do to mitigate that risk and deal with it. A number of them Ed talked about, and I'll hit as well. And so and there are things, and the risks range from the really big, scary stuff. If you're in critical infrastructure, the breaches with national security implications, or the large scale, the breach that probably got everyone's attention more than any other breach recently was the Target breach, just because of the size and scope and the dollar amount that goes along with that. All the way that, but all the way down the spectrum too, to the day-to-day stuff. If you've got any valuable information digitally, in your organization, whether it's personal information, customer information, intellectual property, business plans, proprietary information, that could be at risk, and it could be again a big issue, or it could be a small issue that you're trying to figure out. You notice some malware. Is this something that was targeted at us, or is this something that's kind of out there in the a botnet that's out there infecting lots of people? It's not really going to cause a lot of damage. We can clean it up. So you think about how do you protect your company, your business, your reputation, and as a lawyer, that's my role. So I'm an in-house lawyer at IBM, focusing on these issues. You think about liability, right? So what are your liability risks? What are the legal requirements, and how do you protect your company from that? So I'm going to focus a little bit on that legal side of things, and to get to the heart of that. we'll talk about the law. And I know, most of you are not lawyers, so good for you. So I won't bore you, I promise, get into the weeds. But just to set the context, and ask the question, what is cybersecurity law here in the United States? And then we'll probably talk about outside the United States as well, with some data privacy law. But what is that law? It's computer security has been around for a while, but the concept of cybersecurity legal obligations is developing still. It really is. And the answer is there is no overarching omnibus cybersecurity law here in the U.S. There's a lot of law that touches on the issues, but it's very fragmented. It's very sector specific. So, for example, if you're a financial institution or a healthcare provider, you're really you're among the most regulated entities in the country with respect to data protection and security. So you're going to be immersed in this stuff. There's laws like HIPAA and Graham-Leach-Bliley that are going to apply to you. The credit card industry, energy industry, federal government contractors. Those sectors have specific requirements that get incorporated through law, regulation, or contract, voluntary agreement. So if you're in those sectors, you're kind of immersed in a lot of this. But if you're not, what applies to you? There are some state laws, some states that have not a majority, but a number of states that have passed laws addressing security requirements. So Massachusetts is one of the leading ones. Requires any business handling personal information, customer information, to have a comprehensive information security program and the requirements that go along with that. Most states, it's 47 now. I think Kentucky was the 47th just a couple months ago. Have data breach notification laws. So if you're a company doing business in that state or have customers in that state and their personal information is breached, there are requirements to notify them of that breach. There are other federal laws that deal with the security in the federal government, the security of those systems. There's the Homeland Security Act, which created DHS, Department of Homeland Security, that gives DHS some responsibilities with respect to the private sector and critical infrastructure. There's the criminal laws. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is our anti-hacking criminal law, essentially, here in the U.S. But these are very specific areas. It's really a patchwork of issues, and it's not kind of a comprehensive framework. And it's also relatively old. The last major piece of federal legislation to really deal with cybersecurity on a very substantive level was 2002, so 12 years ago, which is really a long time when you think of the technologies that have developed since then. So this has led to over the last 5 years, this patchwork has led to a debate, a policy debate of several key issues in Congress and the administration. And you can boil them down to what should there be standards, cybersecurity standards for critical infrastructure, and that has been the focus. If you're going to focus on any sectors, it should, the banking sectors, the transportation networks, the healthcare sectors, the water treatment, chemical plants, the like. And should those standards, how much should they be voluntary and how much should they be regulated by the government? There's been debates about sharing threat information, cyber threat information and data between government and industry, and the privacy issues that raises. And then the liability framework, the standard of care. What is considered reasonable, and what should companies be doing when there's to prevent incidents? The debates have really started, I'd say, about 5 years ago, with a more kind of regulatory approach, with proposals in Congress and the White House to give DHS some regulatory authority to set standards for critical infrastructure and to some extent enforce them. That was defeated in Congress. There was a lot of concern in industry, IBM among them, that you don't want government in the situation of setting these technical standards that will be outdated before they're even become law, and then won't be able to keep up with the threat and will hurt innovation. So the administration and the Congress moved more toward a voluntary approach. And last year, last February, President Obama issued an executive order on cybersecurity in which one of the main kind of centerpieces of that order was he tasked NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is a non-regulatory agency within the Department of Commerce that sets standards for many things, among them for cybersecurity for the government itself. He tasked them with working with industry over a year to come up with a voluntary framework, a voluntary set of practices and guidance for critical infrastructure primarily, but for industry at large as well, to be able to use to mitigate their cyber risk. And that was I think that process is now over. It ended this February, and they came out with this framework. I think it got very good reviews as a process. It was very open, very collaborative between government and industry, and really came up with a model that is not kind of this check the box compliance model, which we were concerned about, but more of an approach to how to manage risk. So if you haven't seen it, you should take a look at it. It's on the NIST website. Whether you're a big kind of mature organization with a mature cybersecurity program, it's very helpful to kind of check that against what you're doing. Or if you're smaller or you don't have a mature program, it's a great tool to start one from scratch and really check off, and it addresses many of the exact same issues that Ed had up on his slides. And it's supposed to be adaptable to all different organizations. So what it does, is it goes through the different categories of issues, asset management, access control, your governance, your monitoring and detection, your incident response, et cetera. And it breaks them down into specific categories and then lists a bunch of globally recognized standards that are widely used in industry to help in those areas. And it's not saying you have to use this standard or this technology or this tool, but it's a way basically to track all those different categories and look at your own risk profile and decide, is this something where, what's most important to us, where are the biggest gaps, what's cost efficient for us to address and to track the progress towards. So that's been probably the main legal development over the last year in cybersecurity. And it's interesting because so it's voluntary, right? It's not required, it's not regulated, but there's a kind of this sense, well, at some point it will be, regulators will start to use it and it'll become this standard of care that courts will look to. And there's a lot to discuss about that. I mean, the one thing is, as I said, it's not this checklist of you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. So it's not really conducive to being regulated in that way. But I think we'll see. I think SEC recently has used this framework in putting out guidance to broker dealers to say these are the types of questions we're going to ask you and the issues we're going to be interested in and want you to focus on when we come and do your examination. So it will be a tool, I think, for lots of people to use and look at. So to hit real quick to conclude, best practices. So what are the things, using that framework and other tools, what are the things you should be doing? I'm going to give a lawyerly disclaimer. I can't give you all legal advice, right? I can only give IBM legal advice. So you should talk with your own lawyers about this, and that's actually one of my suggestions. But these are some of the basics that everyone talks about and are really, I think, fundamental and important to think about. So I'll start with the legal team. I'll give a pitch for the lawyers. You should be integrated with your legal team on cybersecurity issues. It's important from a legal perspective to understand what the legal landscape is, the liability landscape, but also, it's often, I think, you'll find in many companies the general counsel, along with the chief information security officer, a really good partnership because they're really focused on the risk. They understand the risk. They're trying to protect the company from that risk, and the general counsel can be a great advocate in your company for that. Governance. So a chief information security officer, as Ed's chart showed, having that as one of the main key things you can do. Someone who can manage your information security program, who's accountable, who can report up the chain. If there are not enough resources, who can be an advocate for that and really be describe the risk. And having that person and their organization manage a security program and framework where you're going to, much like the NIST framework, you're going to look at all the different categories, look at where your gaps are, and track progress and set goals. Crown jewels. So, we talk about, this is a risk-based strategy, right? So you can't eliminate all risk. So where are you going to focus? You should absolutely be focusing on, where's your most important information, and how are you treating that information? The information that if it got stolen from your company or organization would be, the biggest problem for you. Focus on those types of crown jewels and how they're being protected and managed. Incident response is really important, right? Another thing that was on Ed's slides. You need to have a plan for what do you do when there is an incident, and many incidents, start out to, look like maybe they're just little, and then they turn out to be something big, or maybe they look big and they turn out to be little. You need to have a process and a plan in place to manage those incidents, to know who's in charge of what the roles and responsibilities are, how you're going to get a forensic examination, and how you're going to coordinate within your company in responding to that. And responding as quickly as you can. I think as I think of as a lawyer, when you think of reasonableness, and if a court were later to look at what we did here, what's one of your main kind of thoughts is we want to respond quickly. You don't want to respond too quickly in terms of public announcements or notification if you don't have your facts set yet. So that's really important. But you don't want to sit on things internally either. And there are reports of major breaches out there in the newspapers where a company had some sign of something about a month before they did something about it. You don't want to be in that situation. Last couple of things, your supply chain, your vendors. You could do everything in the world to protect your own data inside your company, but who else are you giving it to? Who else are you giving access to? Ed mentioned an HVAC company as an example, so it's been public knowledge that the Target breach came through an HVAC, their HVAC vendor. So their air conditioning and heating company had a connection through their billing system to their network, and that was how the hackers got in and eventually got to their payment system. So you want to make sure you understand where all your connections are. Employee training and awareness. Your people are the weakest links here, whether it's intentional or unintentional. There's always somebody that's going to click on a link or introduce some type of vulnerability, even if they have the best intentions. One of the trainings that we do and that other companies out there do is a phishing exercise. So you send out a fake phishing email to all your employees. And you see if they click on it, and then you follow up with a message about how this was an exercise and some training. And we try not to ding people too hard for it, but I think it's really important to set that culture and awareness. So if now they're okay with another one, I clicked on that one, another one might be coming in a couple months. Really puts them on the lookout. And finally, last thing is relationships with government and law enforcement. Those, at some point you may have to have a conversation with the FBI, with the Secret Service. They may come to you. You may need to come to them about a breach. Really important to establish those relationships beforehand, so there's a level of trust and contact there. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I was so excited to be on this panel, mostly because I was looking forward to listening to my panelists, and I haven't been disappointed. They've been so interesting. Let's see. No, this is the wrong thing. That's the right thing. There you go. So, we talk about big data so much now in the news, and it sounds like this thing that's coming at us. And I'm sitting here close to where I had my first job after college. I worked for Alan Greenspan's economic consulting firm. And it was way before anybody had ever thought of big data. But of course, people were using data. We were doing forecasting of industrial production or forecasting of macroeconomic trends. The difference is with digitization, we now have that much better data and that much more data. And also the data isn't only coming from the government. It's not all government collected data. A lot of it is in the private sector, and a lot of it is coming from individuals. So one of the things I want to talk about privacy. And main thing I want to say is that in the information age, personal data has become really a key asset for many businesses and a driver of business opportunities. But at the very same time, it's a responsibility and it's a risk. And business leaders and lawyers can't afford to leave it to the engineers. So that's the main thing I want to talk about. So first, just talking about it as an asset. And the one thing I want to say about data is not all data is personal data. So what is personal data? Personal data, there are many definitions, but personal data is usually defined as data that identifies an individual or that when linked to other data can identify an individual. And this in itself is hard to determine. And it can encompass more data than companies even realize. So and that's what we really want to focus on. So data as an asset, and here you can't really separate the upside from the downside risks. The companies that are going to be most successful in the information age are the ones that are going to be able to extract value out of data at the same time as protecting the privacy of companies. That's where your competitive advantage is. It's not exploiting the hell out of the data. It's figuring out how to use it and protect privacy. The amount of data that is available to companies is absolutely staggering. There's an estimate that the amount of digital information we generate doubles every 2 years. This is from International Data Corporation. I'm not sure I can pronounce this number. 7.9 zettabytes expected in 2015, which for those of us who don't know what a zettabyte is, that's equal to 18 million times the amount of information in the Library of Congress. So that's how much will be in 2015. So really, learning how to leverage it, but learning how to protect people's privacy is a challenge. Innovations in cloud computing, as you all know, have made it possible to store and analyze these huge data sets in ways that weren't possible decades ago. Data can be split up and stored in different servers, can provide all kinds of efficiencies and economies of scale. Also, when aggregated and analyzed, the data can create unprecedented opportunities to provide products and services that are better tailored to customers' preferences. It helps companies spend their advertising dollars more wisely. So it creates all kinds of efficiencies. It can get you better products. It can lead to all kinds of innovation. And then, of course, there's the coming Internet of Things, which I'm personally very excited about. It's going to bring consumers smart homes, smart cars, other connected devices, and it's also going to lead to changes in how we manufacture. It's going to really blur the distinction between services and manufacturing. I think that'll open up all kinds of growth possibilities for the United States and other places. But also, all this information that's going to come out of the Internet of Things is going to make possible incredible developments in health, in energy efficiency, in traffic patterns. So it could really transform a lot of social goods and economic goods and really create big societal benefits. Okay, that's the good side. Enough of that. So what about the responsibility and the risk? So in addition to creating all these exciting new opportunities, customers are just going to be reluctant to share data if they don't know how it's going to be used. And they're not going to adopt new products eventually if they don't trust that companies are going to handle their data properly. That's just a given. But that sounds kind of vague. Let's get really specific about the dangers. There's class action lawsuits. Consumers have responded when they believe companies have mishandled their data. Class action lawsuits that allege violations of privacy are on the rise. And then consumer privacy regulators, especially the Federal Trade Commission and the state's attorney general, have increased their enforcement actions against companies that have allegedly violated privacy laws or failed to honor the commitments they've made in their privacy policies. Then, of course, the data breach issue that we've talked about, which in addition to all those dramatic costs, as you alluded to, there's reputational risk. that's very substantial, and a huge loss of efficiency while you're dealing with all this. So the costs are even greater than the enormous costs that you laid out, as you said. And in response to the data breaches, the FTC and the state attorneys general have increased their data security enforcement actions. And the FTC will even bring enforcement actions against companies that haven't suffered a data breach but nonetheless have inadequate data security safeguards in place, which is why you need consultants. That's a free plug.
And lawyers.
And FTC enforcement actions, when they happen, can be incredibly burdensome. Although the FTC has limited authority to impose civil fines, it can subject and regularly subjects companies to 20-year audits by an independent third party. So you really don't want to be in that situation. And then, of course, there's the international regulatory situation. International data protection authorities and regulators, particularly those in Europe, and we'll talk about Europe in a second, have become increasingly active and have not shied away from asserting jurisdiction against multinational companies headquartered in the U.S. And one of the things that's been in the news is this whole issue with the European Court of Justice, where they held that individuals have the right to require Google and other search engines that operate in the EU to remove links to web pages that contain out-of-date or inaccurate personal information about them. And this may sound like, oh, it's just a Google problem, but it's not just a Google problem. It's about companies that have websites in the EU, and it's also that kind of assertion of authority that's happening. So, in general, companies that fail to consider and address the risks of personal data collection can suffer negative media coverage, they can harm their brand, they can subject themselves to legal action from plaintiffs or regulators. And this just gives you an up-to-date what's happening. So the states are acting quite a bit. California is the most aggressive, but really because companies operate across the 50 states, one very assertive state can really become the de facto standard for the country. Bunch of developments in California. Last year, California amended the California Online Privacy Protection Act to require all websites and online services to make certain disclosures about whether they allow online tracking by third parties, whether they respond to do not track signals. On January 1st, 2015, another California law designed to protect the privacy of children and teenagers is going to go into effect. This will require websites and online services to allow children and teens to request removal of content that they previously posted online, so similar to that European right to be forgotten. And the state attorney general, Kamala Harris in California, has been very active, and we don't expect that that's going to change anytime soon. But just in general across the states, just in the last 2 years, we've had more than 24, last year, more than 24 new privacy laws. So this is very active at the state level. The White House just recently did a big data report, and there's been legislation for the last couple of years that's been in Congress, hasn't been passed. They did a relook. They said, do we still need a consumer privacy bill of rights? Has the Internet of Things really changed things? And they said, well, there have been some changes, but we still need it. And so they've tasked the Commerce Department to solicit comments and draft legislation on a consumer privacy bill of rights. And they also put attention on something that's increasingly getting attention in Washington, which is not just collection and transparency about collection, but also the use of data. Is data being used in some way that becomes discriminatory? And that's a really, really interesting twist on things. And they focused on that, and then the FTC just came out with a report on data brokers where they too talked about this issue. So just to focus on the FTC for a second, Chairman Edith Ramirez has explained the FTC is particularly concerned that the algorithms used to analyze big data could lead to the discrimination of certain types of people, but also that there are inferences that companies can make about people based on data-rich personal profiles. But they have been really clear that they also believe in the benefits of big data. So again, it's not no big data. It's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's how can companies leverage this, use it, but in a way that protects privacy. Okay, so just what about international? So if you thought it was complicated in the U.S. with all these states and regulatory agencies, wait till you go overseas. There are privacy laws in almost 100 countries, and many of these are much stricter than in the U.S. So in the US, for example, non-consumer facing companies don't have an obligation to notify consumers about the data they collect, but a recently updated Australian privacy law actually puts a greater emphasis on this kind of data for those who are not just collecting it from the consumers. Over the last several years, more than a dozen countries have enacted new privacy laws governing collection and use. And in the EU, which has the most restrictive privacy regime, privacy is really seen as a fundamental right. And it's really interesting talking to people in the EU. They say, you don't understand. You guys talk about the First Amendment all the time, freedom of speech. Well, to us, privacy is the same kind of value. And we come back and say to them, well, you say that, but actually you have all these laws in the books, but we actually enforce in a more targeted way, whether it's HIPAA for healthcare or other kinds of very targeted things. But that philosophical difference really matters to them quite a bit. They really think of it as a fundamental right. And so a very big priority for them after these recent elections is going to be new data protection regulations. There was also that European Court of Justice opinion that I mentioned. They found jurisdiction over Google because Google has a subsidiary in Spain that sells online advertising space. But up until now, each European law has had its own, each country has had its own laws. And so there's been some flexibility, and the UK and Ireland have exploited this. There's been some prosecutorial flexibility. But after the election, it's generally accepted that they will come together and work on this draft EU regulation that's been under consideration for some time and impose stricter requirements on companies, possibly subject them to fines up to 5% of their annual global revenues for violations. And it's going to harmonize standards across Europe, so there'll be much less chance for this flexibility, and it could bring all the countries up to German standards, which are really quite demanding. So, there's Europe. So I don't want to, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give you legal advice, but what are some of the things you need to focus on? First one is, of course, get a CPO. Hire and empower a chief privacy officer who's going to develop and implement a data privacy and security program. And it's really important that the privacy program work with the security program. You can't have two separate programs that aren't talking to each other. These are incredibly important. The CPO has to work with the Office of the General Counsel, the Chief Information Officer, the product managers, and all the relevant officials in the company to conduct regular risk assessments. So that's that focus on risk and managing it and assessing it. Data flows. You have to know what your data flows are, obviously, if you can figure out privacy, how to use them, who do you share them with, et cetera. You have to require vendors and other third parties with whom you share data to honor obligations. If this issue, for instance, about discrimination, you have to have contracts with your third parties. How is the data being used? And then you need to regularly assess and update company policies to address new legal requirements and best practices. And if you're doing these kinds of things and you're doing the kinds of risk assessments that we've heard about here on the security side, and you're constantly updating and managing and then extremely sensitive of the new policies and new regulations that are popping up every day, then you'll be in shape to manage the asset that you now have at your fingertips. Thank you very much.
Shall I just go ahead and?
Yes, you just read it.
Okay. I have a question here on stolen intellectual property. IP, intellectual property, is very broad from patented technologies to creative content. Is there a further breakdown of what IP is higher risk to be stolen or hacked into? I'll just jump at this quickly and say I think there is, but it depends on which group we're talking about. So if you're talking about the different threat agent actors, competitors or people who would like to sell to a competitor are more likely to steal intellectual property. State-sponsored activity, I mean, it's been in the press, and I can tell you we've helped clients deal with this. Other competing nations will steal intellectual property for that purpose. The days when I think music and things like that was an issue is really sort of gone, by the wayside. And then there's intellectual property, I would just say that is especially powerful in financial markets. We're finding that algorithmic trading, algorithms that actually evolve rather quickly, are extraordinarily important and valuable. And even when an employee leaves from one financial house and goes to another, a lot of times there's a concern, I think there's a story about this in the Times just today, about whether or not it was taken with them. And that kind of theft of intellectual property often goes on, and it's a subset of the insider side. So I'll just quickly stop on that. I don't know if you have anything to add to it. Thank you.
It's not my question.
Do most companies engage consultants like yourself post-breach, or are they engaging you in a preventative effort? Most do it post-breach, but I think things are getting a lot better. I think, and just to build on some of the points that Andrew and Karen mentioned, also the Securities and Exchange Commission is asking very good questions now about broker-dealers and financial advisors in this area. And I would say in the last 6 months, we are getting much more attention about post-breach, hey, let's get on top of this than we did before. Secondly, do companies that suffer breaches buy into better preventative measures afterward, or do they revert to business as usual? That's a good question. I think if we're only brought in an incident and then we don't sustain the relationship, we won't really know. For the ones that we have stayed in, I think there is a big improvement in these areas. But unless they engage us to assess and continue to take a look at it, we're not sure. We look for is the incentive system inside companies and whether or not there's a disconnect. In our interviews and questionnaires, we ask the same questions of the executives as we do with the IT people. If they are aligned and they kind of have the same view of things and it's accurate, that's pretty good. But more often we see the top people think things are great, and we talk to the IT people running and they know they're not. And we say this is not going to go well. And unless they fix that, then it's going to be business as usual, managing fear more than problems. Let's see. And please jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, and I think it's important, to respond to a breach, understanding the big picture strategy, and just talking to your senior leadership team, and not just trying to fix the technical problem or vulnerability that happened in that breach. Because if you're a big company, there's a lot of, like I was saying, day-to-day stuff. It doesn't have to be a big breach, but you see vulnerabilities here or there, and you're trying to plug, and you're just kind of, putting your fingers in the dam and then move on. You really need to stop and take a lessons learned approach and look at the big picture strategy and as it applies to your whole security program. So you're thinking about other ways that you can be breached, and not just the way that you were breached before.
And I just passed over the cards because they're less
Sure.
to me, I think.
Could you address the reputational risk from companies sharing data with the NSA? As, for example, in the Verizon case, as reported in the Snowden revelations. Also, the risk due to spying by the NSA and intellectual property. In other words, should companies pressure for better privacy protections from government surveillance, or is the solution better encryption? So I'll address the second question first. And one of the things that the U.S. government has come out and said repeatedly is that it does not spy on companies to steal intellectual property, and that's a cultural difference we have with countries like China, for example, where our government says our intelligence apparatus is focused on national security issues of concern and national security targets, foreign intelligence. We're not stealing intellectual property from one Chinese company to give a competitive advantage to an American company. The Chinese, there's been a lot of back and forth on this lately, and with the recent indictments, and the Chinese have kind of said, well, economic prosperity is part of our national security, and so there's a cultural difference there as well. It's no different from you protecting your own national security through the surveillance you're doing. So that's been part of the issue. The reputational risk from companies sharing data with the NSA. Obviously the last year has been challenging for a number of companies that have been in these related to these disclosures, and many of these companies are required by law to comply with court orders and the like, and a lot of the revelations were are often sensationalized and make it sound like there are broader things happening than there actually are. And so there's no question it's been a reputational issue, particularly in Europe, right? I would say, given the focus on the privacy rights in Europe, if you're a US IT company doing business over there, you hear a lot from customers about this as a source of concern.
Yeah, the one thing I'd add is that there are the direct effects of the NSA on the specific companies that are involved, but then there's this broader effect where there was a lot of sort of subliminated or stopped, people were stopping themselves from being protectionist about the data world. And after the NSA revelations, I think a lot of countries felt a little more inclined to use some of these issues as a way to ask for data localization, as really a way to do commercial competition. And we were really lucky, and I think this was the result of a lot of private sector diplomacy and public sector diplomacy. Brazil, which was really upset, and there was a big popular pushback on the fact that the president, we had been listening in on her phone calls apparently, or that was what was in the press. They were really considering this very draconian data localization bill, and it would have really hurt, everybody. It was a hotel there, or a bank. I mean, it's not just a Google. And fortunately, what they eventually passed was much less draconian. But you see that around the world, that people are post-NSA, even though the U.S. companies are used there, are great commercially, are popular with users, there's a nationalist sentiment that, why aren't our companies doing as well in the digital world? And this, combined with the popular dissatisfaction with what they read about the NSA, can sometimes be really problematic. So our diplomats and trade negotiators are really working on that.
So I think this is the last one.
Yeah, or did you get to yours?
Yeah.
Can you provide some recommendations on what folks should be doing against AETs? They've been around for some time, they're almost the de facto.
You stumped the panel.
APTs, maybe?
AET, or
What do we mean by AET? Okay. Oh, yeah.
Advanced evasion techniques.
no, okay. So, well, I think there's always a way to evade detection. First of all, what I see is when something occurs, even if there is an indication that it's happened, people are either not looking at it or looking at it and not reporting it up. There's even press reports that occurred, at the Target side, where they actually had some pretty good things in place with FireEye and it didn't escalate. But the evasion techniques can either be to attack your detection systems so that they do not actually capture and report what's there, or it's just a very stealthy thing and maybe a company doesn't have a sophisticated detection effort, and the code sits inside the network. There are some very pernicious software out there that is commercially available. Anybody can go and get it, versions of Zeus. It sits there, the computer isn't affected by it, nobody's looking to see, they don't check for it, they don't have any type of detection system, and it's very effective. They have been around for a while, and I don't see it going away anytime real soon, but I think efforts like this and some of the points that would be made will, I think, cause people to address these with more force and invest more in their security. And I do think, as the ambassador was pointing out, I've never seen a time when reputational risk was so threatened and where good compliance was seen as a good brand. Before, if somebody had a security problem, it didn't cause customers to say, I won't shop in your store. Now they're saying, my God, my privacy may be at risk. I think I'll go to the next store. To my knowledge, I have not seen that occur before, and I think it'll have an effect. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to our panelists. Excellent way to bring this to closure. Just a couple of closing thoughts. Number one, thank you again to all of our panelists, all of our speakers, to all of you for taking time out of your probably very crazed days to be here. I do want to thank Ernst & Young, Nielsen, Verizon, Goodwill of New York and New Jersey, McGraw-Hill Financial for being our sponsors today. as well as our event supporters, and of course, our program committee and staff. There are evaluation forms in your kit. Please fill them out and give them to us. We will be back in 2015 with the next forum. We'll really appreciate all of your thoughts about this one. We'll be talking to many of you as we build year to year on this topic, which is not going away, it's only evolving. We started out saying this program is about the material world, managing risk and value. Hopefully you've been able to kind of get a gestalt here of all the intricacies that are involved with that and how we really need to focus on it in almost every aspect of what we do, because it all ends up being about trust and the brand and whether or not consumers and we as consumers are going to trust the companies that are involved in our daily lives. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of the Better Business Bureau, our officers, our directors, all of our accredited businesses. Anybody that's not an accredited business, as Rhonda said, please talk to us. And with that, I will say enjoy the day. It's sunny out.